Hi, welcome back to an introduction to audio programming, a presentation of the 1X Developer Podcast. I'm Brendan,
And I'm Colin.
and this is a segment we call Make Mine a Double Precision Floating Point Value, where I don't know, we do a presentation. We drink a little beer, maybe. Um, Einstein said, maybe, probably, maybe. If you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. Here at the podcast, we say if you can't explain it after you've had a six pack, you don't understand it yourself. So we are here drinking beer on a Sunday, presenting, talking about digital audio. In the last segment, we talked about sound in the real world, how it's kind of a wave that propagates through a medium. Now we're going to talk about what happens to that sound, how it gets into your computer, right? How do we represent a continuous wave in digital form inside the computer? So, we have a wave like this. What's happening when it comes into your computer is there's a circuit called a analog to digital converter. And so like if you have an audio interface like this, you might have something like this.
The good old DAC.
Exactly. Yeah. Uh, DAC is going the other way, right? So DAC's on the back and coming out going digital audio, digital to analog. But in this case, you have analog to digital.
The good old ad. Yeah.
It doesn't really roll off the tongue. But yeah, if you have a microphone or a guitar or whatever plugged into your audio interface, then you have a continuous waveform, an analog waveform that's coming into the audio interface. And what the audio interface is doing, what that analog digital converter is doing, is sampling the continuous waveform periodically. So it's looking at it, every so many milliseconds and saying like this is the value, and then it's taking that value and matching it as closely as it can to a digital value based on like whatever floating point precision is allowed, right?
Mhm.
So each of these dots in this example is like that's where we sample it, and that's where we take a digital measurement of the continuous waveform at that time, right? And so when we do that, we end up with an approximation of the analog waveform. Um, when we're talking about these sampling rates, we're talking about things that are pretty fast. Like even back in the CD days, like the early CD days, which I think goes back to the 80s, maybe. Um, we're talking about sampling rates of like 44,000 times a second. So we can approximate a continuous waveform pretty closely using very 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 fast sampling. Um, if you look in your DAW and you look at sampling rate options and stuff like that, you can see that the options are something like 44,000, 48,000, things like that. That's how many times per second the continuous waveform, the analog waveform, is being read and sampled.
Mm-hmm. I remember I worked with a guy who had a cochlear implant,
Mm.
and he was talking about how apparently it works kind of like he uses some digital circuitry, because he was saying that string instruments, things with like a lot of like analog changes in the waveform, really generally sounded like crap. But things like you know any kind of digital music or like keys, very like discrete sounds, that sounded pretty good to him.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and you'll notice that like whenever you have like the on hold music that people always complain about, they
Yeah.
always want to play classical music with a lot of string instruments and a lot of like very small changes in these analog sounds, that these very complicated waves all going all at the same time, and they sound terrible.
Yeah.
But if they were to just play like, I mean, obviously, like if they were playing chip tunes, it would sound great. That's why chip tunes exist, basically. But if they
Mhm.
played like if just like drums, something more drum centric, you know, more rhythmic rather than shifting frequencies like that with a big broad range of frequencies at once.
Have they tried some Skrillex?
Uh, they should.
Yeah. I mean yeah, that's fascinating. Does some of that have to do with the compression of the phone line? I've always
Oh,
kind of
probably that
wondered.
too. Oh well, yeah. Actually, I think what it more is the number of channels, right? Like a phone. I think a phone can only have like 8 channels at once, like 8 different frequencies at once.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, I think that's more what it is really, rather than the sampling rate. But it made me think of that, so I said it.
Yeah.
That's what I do here.
No, I mean, sampling rates on digital cochlear. I mean, I'm sure that cochlear implants have some kind of analog to digital converter, just like we're talking about, right? They convert it and then they do some kind of processing in the digital realm on it, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of yeah. So the key point here is just that you're approximating the analog waveform with these discrete digital points. It's important that your digital approximation of the waveform doesn't have any that the samples are pretty close together, right? You don't want to have any big jumps. So like this big jump that I have demonstrated right here, that's a bad thing, and it will manifest as like a click or a pop in the audio.
Mm-hmm.
You really want to avoid that in digital audio. You want to yeah, you don't want to jump. You don't want these huge jumps between samples, basically.
So what did the analog? What would the analog version of this have looked like? Was this just a very sharp drop? Like obviously it wasn't like directly vertical, right? Like that.
Well, something like a record skip could be like a sharp drop like that.
Mm-hmm.
Something like I don't know, pounding a table or something like that could be a sharp drop. Something that doesn't really have a like a frequency component to it, really. Um, I don't know. That's not quite right because drums don't really have a frequency component, right? Um, but something that like a record skip, but mostly in the digital world, when we're talking about these discrepancies, they are digitally created. They
Okay.
don't they don't usually exist in the analog world, just because analog sounds don't usually do that,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
and that's kind of part of the thing. But I think that's maybe not always intuitive for someone who is just getting into this. Is like you you can't just jump from the highest value to the lowest value. You need to ease into it a little bit, like it does in the real world, basically.
Right.
So we're going to talk about some terminology here. The sampling rate and the sampling frequency, kind of different words for the same thing, but that's the number of times that the continuous waveform is sampled. It's measured in hertz, so the number of times it's sampled per second. You'll see it as like F sub S in formulas. But yeah, you can just think of that as the number of times that your analog to digital converter is sampling the analog waveform. And then you have your sampling interval, which is the amount of time between each sample. And that's, the sampling interval and the sampling frequency are related. One determines the other, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So if you have a sampling rate of 48,000 hertz, the sampling interval is 1/48,000. And, so we're talking about, I don't know, Colin, you tell me, what was that, microseconds? Talking about milliseconds? I don't even know.
Uh,
Got 4 zeros there.
yeah, I don't know. Less than
It's
milliseconds.
yeah, it's a very small amount of time between each sample. Um, I
Right,
just
which
think
makes sense
that
because the frequency is 48,000 samples per second.
yeah,
Right.
I
So yeah, that's very fast.
I think that's really just interesting to think about. It's like even decades ago. we had computers that were capable of sampling at these kinds of rates. Um, it's not just like modern hardware that's able to do that. It's the CDs that you were playing in the 90s were able to do this for sure.
Yeah. You might not know this off the top of your head. Is this a normal frequency, like 48,000? Is there a reason you pick that number, or?
Yeah, 48,000 is a very typical frequency. Um, 40 so CDs are 44,100 by that's kind of the standard. Um, these days, I think that most people run at 48,000 or so. Um, but most audio interfaces these days can run even much higher than that. They can run into like 192,000, things like that.
Jeez.
Yeah. So
I have to imagine there's a point of diminishing returns there somewhere, right?
there is. I yeah, I feel like we've kind of been, I don't know, I may be speaking out of school here, but I kind of think we've been stopped at where we've been for quite a while. Like,
Yeah.
there's only so much sampling much, much, much faster just doesn't really gain you much. Yeah.
I would think so. Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is the Nyquist frequency. So there's kind of a weird mathematical concept that I'm not able to explain to you. But basically, the highest frequency that can be represented by a digital sound is half of the sampling rate. It has to do with this kind of strange effect called aliasing. But if you sample an analog waveform at 48,000 hertz, the highest frequency that you can represent is 24,000 hertz. And so that's kind of why 44,100 and 48,000 hertz, those are popular sampling rates because the Nyquist frequency then is pretty much above the range of human hearing, right?
Right.
So we talked in the last slide or in the last presentation about 20,000 hertz ish is about the upper end of human hearing. So if you're sampling at 48,000 hertz, you can represent up to 24,000 hertz. You shouldn't be able to represent anything there that humans aren't hearing.
And that's what I was kind of getting at with my last question, because I think like the best versions of MP3 files they can represent frequencies that are outside human hearing range. So the argument is that, like, people say like, oh, I need like the actual wave file, I need like the lossless wave file. It's like, well, no, you don't. Just for playback, you don't, right? Like an MP3, a 320 kilobit per second MP3 should be good enough for anybody.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of debate about that. A lot of people insist that you can hear more. I mean, even vinyl records, right? We're gonna talk about vinyl records in a minute. A lot of people insist that you can hear more from a vinyl record versus a vinyl record sampled at 48,000 hertz or whatever it is, which should be able to represent all the frequencies, but it's representing it as those discrete steps that we talked about.
Right.
And some people feel like they can sense the difference between that.
What is bit depth?
So we're talking about when we're talking about bit depth, we're talking about the basically the type of value that each sample is, right? So you can think about like float 32 versus float 64, something like that. Bit depths come in different ranges. There's like 16, 24, 32. But the idea is that the higher the bit depth, the more possible values you have for each sample. When the analog waveform is being sampled, it samples the continuous waveform and it tries to find the closest value that it can represent digitally. The more possible values you have, the more accurately the sound is going to be represented. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
So, but conversely, the more storage each sample is going to take up.
Right.
So, there's kind of a trade-off there. and again, there's kind of, there's debates there about, um, about how, wh- are we
There
taking
should be a
more?
close enough at some point. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. They're diminishing returns again. All right. I'm gonna do a little. I'm gonna do a little sampling of a record here. So I got an analog record here. We're gonna sample it.
My lord, I'm just a blood pourer. 10 seconds left with the earth in my hand. I'm the.
How's that? Better?
Yeah, that sounded good. Yeah.
The only thing I was trying to get to here is just that. So I took a completely analog source, a vinyl record. I plugged it into my audio interface, and I just wanted to show that in Audacity, you can like zoom in all the way to the individual samples, right? I think that's pretty cool. Here's the waveform itself that I sampled from the record, but here's the individual. This is each individual value that was sampled, and there's
Yeah, it's a
even
cool visual. As you zoom in and out, we get a sense of like how the scope of like how many sounds, how many discrete samples we get just with that, 7-second clip or whatever.
yeah, it's mind-boggling. I mean, it really is like crazy how many times you have to sample to get an approximate waveform. And there's even Audacity even has a pencil tool, like you can literally rewrite each of these samples. But the important part is that each value was each sampled value is a floating point value between 1.0 and negative 1.0, and you can kind of see the waveform roughly going back and forth and back and forth, right?
Wait, what is 1.0 and negative 1.0? What are those?
Those are just how, okay, so those are just how we've decided to represent those in digital form. 1.0 is the maximum possible amplitude that can be measured for a sample.
Okay.
So if you go above 1.0, that's when you get clipping. We haven't really talked about clipping, but that's like you can't go any higher than 1. And so like if you start sampling and you see that your audio interface is hitting like all red for the inputs, right? That's because you're going to see like an audio, all of these samples will be like at 1.0, and they'll be like clipped, and you're going to be losing information because they can't go above 1.0. Does that make sense?
I think so.
It's the highest possible value that can be sampled.
Is that the highest possible, like anywhere? Like that's just a hard cap.
Well, there's no such thing as the highest possible in the analog world. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can. Yeah, this is where things get a little weird. It's like there's no such thing as the highest possible value in the analog world. Things can get very, 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 very loud. How loud is an airplane? Well, it kind of depends on like where you're standing and all that kind of stuff. 1.0 is the highest value that we've decided can be represented for the digital representation of the sound.
Okay.
And so if you're messing with your input level knob and your analog waveform is coming in, and 1.0 is, regardless of what the sound is, 1.0 is the highest value that can be represented. And if you're,
so what is negative 1?
The waveform goes back and forth. So negative 1 is also the highest. Negative 1 is the lowest, right? If you have a sine wave that's going up and down and up and down, 1 is the highest, negative 1 is the lowest. It can also clip in the negative range. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but
Well, okay. I feel like I'm having a moment. So, like, are we talking about volume, or are we talking about like frequency, pitch?
This is about volume. Yeah.
Okay, this is volume. So, the lowest volume would be like no sound, right?
No sound is 0. So, okay. So if you think about this is good. Think about the first section of the presentation. We talked about air molecules moving back and forth, right? This is the digital representation of that is back and forth and back and forth. 0 is no movement. 0 means that there's no vibration at all. When things are vibrating, they're vibrating between some number and the negative opposite of that, right?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So if you drew a line at 0.5 across, that's just a solid tone.
0.5 across.
It's just a straight line across.
Yes, that would be a solid tone. Dope. What I said here is incorrect. A digital audio file that had all values of 0.5 would be silenced, just like a file that had all values of 0.0. It's really the movement back and forth, the change in the amplitude of the waveform that creates the audible sound. There's an important distinction between all zeros and all 0.5, and it's related to a concept called DC offset. The file with all 0.5 would basically have a constant DC offset. You can look into that a little more if you're interested, but for our purposes here, that file would not be audible.
Yeah, okay, cool.
But that doesn't, it's worth noting that doesn't correspond with, you could only create that digitally. Like,
right, yeah.
That doesn't correspond with anything in the analog world.
Yeah, cool. I'm with you.
Yeah. So, no, that's really good. Yeah, zero is no movement. If you record a silent wave, I could even demonstrate that in Audacity here. You'll see just all zeros in your samples.
Nice.
Cool. So in the next section, we're going to talk about an overview of the audio callback cycle, like how an audio application works and things like that. Yeah, catch you in the next section.
Nice.
1X Developer Podcast.
Hey everybody, this is Colin. First and foremost, I want to thank you all for listening to this episode of the 1X Developer Podcast, and let you know that if you have any questions, comments, or if you just want to tell us about your day, you can reach us at X, formerly known as Twitter, at 1X Developer Podcast. We're also on YouTube at 1X Developer Podcast. You can email us if you're weird at 1xdeveloperpodcast@protonmail.com. And lastly, don't forget to follow, subscribe, all that stuff, so you don't miss any further episodes of the 1X Developer Podcast. Thanks so much. See you next time.